People. My name is David Farrell. I'm the Old Fat Guy, and I'm the author of The Old Fat Guy's Beginner's Guide to Smoking Meat. So what I'm going to do today is we're going to have a little webinar on how to pull pork in a smoker. So I'm just going to pull up my display here, and just give me a moment. And okay, and there we are. Now, if anything happens during it that you disconnect it, I'd encourage you to try refreshing your browser. That seems to help in some of these occasions. So what we're going to get right into is how to smoke meat. Now, the first thing if you're going to be doing pulled pork is what kind of meat should you use? Excuse me, here's go. There we go. There we go. There's usually two kinds of meat that are used for pulled pork. There's a pork butt, or it's also called a Boston butt, which is really unfortunate because it's not from the butt of the pig. It's actually one of the shoulder cuts. It's called the butt because that's what they used to call the containers. They stored them way back in the old days. They usually come in a big chunk with skin on them and a bone through the center. There's another cut of meat that can be used for pulled pork, which is a pork shoulder or a pork picnic shoulder. It's still from the shoulder of the pig, but it's a bit farther up and a little different cut. It's very similar, comes with a large bone and the skin still on it in most cases. Generally, a pork butt or a pork shoulder is quite a large cut of meat. It can run any place from 7 to 12 pounds for either one. You can also buy smaller rolled pork butts, or they also call them pork shoulder roasts. They're boneless and have a little less flavor, in my opinion, not as moist as they are. But if you want to cook a little less meat, not cook for quite as long, you can use a rolled roast, and it will work well, and it'll make a good pulled pork. Don't worry about it. Now, are there any questions on what kind of meat you should be using, or on using the different kinds of meat for making pulled pork? I'll just wait a few seconds and just type in a yes first to let me know you have a question coming. If I don't see a yes, I'll go ahead in a few seconds. Okay, and the assumption that there are no questions, we'll go ahead back into the seminar. Now, do not use leaner cuts of meat to make pulled pork. You can get pork loins and all kinds of different cuts. But what makes pulled pork so good is that it's marbled with fat and collagen that when you cook it low and slow, gives you a better, moister, luscious pork. That's why pulled pork is so good. Now, once you've chosen your roast, you have to get it ready. And if it comes and there is a skin on it, you want to take that skin off. And also trim off most of the surface fat. Because what happens is, I'm sorry, there we go. Because what happens is there's a lot of fat in the meat, and you want to get a bark or a nice crust on the outside of the pork. So you don't want to leave a big thick layer of fat and skin over the surface of the pork. Cut right down to the meat. There will be lots of pork fat marbled through the meat. I bet you wish you could cut that faster. Now, are there any questions about preparing the meat, taking the skin off, or any of that? Just type yes if you have a question, and then type the question in, and I'll wait a few seconds. Okay, assuming there's no questions, we'll go on with the webinar. So the next thing you have to decide is whether you want to inject the meat. Now, I'll start off with a bit of discussion about health and injecting meat. There are some people who believe that by injecting meat, you take bacteria from the surface of the meat and you force it down into the into the center of the meat where at low temperatures it can cause you problems. So there is some risk if you choose to use an injection, but I can tell you that competition pulled pork is injected all the time, and I've never heard of anybody having any problems, but I just want you to be aware it's a possible risk. Now, you'll hear people say they want to inject to tenderize the meat or make the meat moister. It just doesn't happen. What makes meat tender is the collagen cooking out over a large period of time. Excuse me. And that also gives the moisture. The reason you inject is to add more flavor to the pork. Now, I don't inject all the time. Sometimes I do. It just adds a little bit of extra seasoning into the meat. Competitors usually inject because they got a judge who's only going to be taking one bite of their pork, and they've got to get every bit of flavor in there they can. So, excuse me. So inject, don't inject, it's up to you. If you want to inject, I've got an injection recipe on the screen here, and don't worry about trying to write it down madly. I'll be sending you a link at the end of this so you can go over this video as a video, everything we talked about. And it's also on my webpage at oldfatguy.ca. So just remember, injections are only about adding flavor. Are there any questions you'd like to ask about injecting meat? And again, type yes, and then let me know. Let me know if you have any questions, and then type the question. So I'll wait a few seconds for a yes. So assuming everybody is all good with that, we'll go back to the webinar. And so the next thing we'll talk about is seasoning the meat, and something called pellicle. Now, it is usual to use a rub on pulled pork, and most of the rubs used in pulled pork are quite sweet. The reason for that is something sweet caramelizes on the surface of pulled pork and gives it what they call a great bark. Real smoked pulled pork has a really hard crust on it, nice and dark, that's just full of flavor, and that comes from that rub with some sugar in it. Now, in the old days, they used to rub the pork roast down with vinegar, with mustard, theoretically to get more rub to stick to the roast. The fact of it is, you don't need any mustard. The rub will stick to the roast well. Now, how much should you use on your pulled pork? You want enough that you got a good coating. Some people will pack it on till it can't take anymore. It's a matter of personal taste. If you really pack it on, you'll end with a really dark bark, almost burnt sugary like. If you put less on, you'll have just a dark bark. Now, I put a recipe up here for my basic rub. Again, you can go back to the video at the end of this, or you can go to my blog, oldfatguy.ca, to get that recipe. And you'll see here that I put on enough rub for this one just to get some color on all sides. That's kind of the default. If you want to make it sweeter and really have bigger flavor, you can put a lot more on. Now, once you've put the rub on, there's something called pellicle. And all pellicle is a dry surface on the meat. You can do it by leaving the meat out on a rack and putting a fan of air over it. My favorite way of doing it is putting it in the fridge uncovered overnight, and that dries the surface of the pork. The reason it's important to get pellicle is because smoke doesn't adhere well to a wet surface. Rather, it gives an off flavor. You just get a lot better flavor and a lot better smoke if you use a dry surface. So are there any questions on pellicle or using a rub or types of rub or any of that kind of process? We have a question from Norm asking, mostly liquid for injection, is there any rules against adding spice to the injection, such as garlic powder and those kind of things? And the answer to that is no. You can put any of those kind of things in the injection if you wish to. but you have to be careful not to put too much in because it won't move through the meat unless it's water soluble like a liquid will. I do know some people who actually use a large injector so they can put chunks of garlic and inject that into the pork so that the garlic cooks and goes through the pork flavor. That normally isn't done for competition because you run a risk of a big chunk of garlic getting in your test bite. But you really can try injecting anything into the meat that you want to as long as you can get it through the injector. The problem is if you use something like chopped garlic and a small injector needle, it can get caught in the needle and block it off on you. Just choose whatever liquids you want, put some spices in it, and then inject about every inch around the surface of the meat. And how much you put in, just a matter of personal taste. Does that answer your question, Norm? Thank you very much, Norm. Okay, so we're just going to go on to the next. Now, when it comes to cooking the pork, you have to learn something new over the way you used to cook. We're used to cooking a pork roast for 15 to 20 minutes a pound, depending on the temperature and what you're doing. But when you're cooking pork, the idea is to cook the pork to an internal temperature, not time. There's a reason for that we'll talk about in a second, but totally get out of your head how long is it going to take the pork to cook. It's going to be what temperature am I going to cook the pork to. And another thing that's interesting is some smokers really pump the smoke out. If you're using a charcoal vertical smoker or an electric smoker with the pucks like the Bradley, they kick out a lot of smoke. It is better to have less smoke than too much smoke. If you have too much smoke, your product will taste like an ashtray and it won't be very tasty. If it's too little, it'll be tasty, just not smoky enough. Now, if you're using a pellet smoker or just a couple of chunks of wood in a vertical or in a big green egg or something like that, you're going to be fine. But it's just a warning. Don't think about, gee, I really got to pour the smoke on. Too much smoke isn't a good thing. The next thing you'll hear a lot of discussion about is what kind of wood smoke should you use. There's lots of argument about this. The classic is hickory. Everybody used hickories for years because where pulled pork came from, that's what was available. But it's become very popular to have apple. Some people like pecan, oak. Competition blend is very popular. That's a mixture of 3 different kinds of wood, and each different maker has their own proprietary blend. So my suggestion would be to try what you'd like, but the standards are hickory if you like a bit stronger smoke flavor, apple if you like a little bit milder, maple, all the rest, they all do well. Now, what temperature should you smoke your pork at? This will cause arguments among smokers. If you get in a group of pitmasters, they will argue back and forth between low and slow and hot and fast and a whole bunch of different things. Traditionally, pork is smoked at between 225 to 250 degrees Fahrenheit or 107 to 120 degrees centigrade. Some people go to 275 degrees Fahrenheit, 135 degrees centigrade, or even higher. Personally, I believe you get a better temperature at the lower temperatures. You get a better texture to the meat. And I also think you get more smoke ring color on the surface of the meat, so it looks better. But there's lots of people out there competing and smoking at 275 degrees and winning contests. So really try both, find out which one you like. Here's another fight you're going to get that's really major discussion among smokers. I said you trim down the meat to get the fat to get to the meat. There's still going to be a little fat left. And the argument is, should that fat side be down facing the heat source on your smoker, or should it be up? Well, the argument is if you put it with the fat side up, the juices from that will soak through your pork and make it moisture. But the people who say put it down say you get a much better bark on the top where there's no fat, and get a bark is really desirable and really tasty. Personally, I find if you've trimmed the fat and skin well, it doesn't make that much difference. Do it whichever way you want. But it is something to keep in mind. Do you want really good bark, or do you want it a little bit more fat soaking over your meat? So there you go. Decide whether you want it up or down. Now, many people like to put a drip pan below their pulled pork, particularly in electric smokers with an electric element at the bottom, just in case the fat drips on the element. But it's usually not needed. If you want to, go ahead. It helps keep your smoker cleaner, but there's no need for it. You just put it right on the rack and go ahead and smoke it if you'd like. If you put a drip pan, it'll be a bit easier to clean up at the end of it. Also, you want to use a remote temperature probe, but I'm going to get more into that in a second. Right now, I'd like to know if you have any questions on the temperature, the kind of wood, how to set it up in your smoker, fat side up, fat side down, anything like that, just about getting it in and started cooking. Okay, Dave's asked me if he has a pellet smoker, and he's asking if there's much difference between the kinds of pellets. And I've got to be honest, no, I don't find a lot of difference between the different kind of pellets. But if you were to use the mildest pellet, like an apple or a cherry, and you were to use the strongest kind of pellet, something like mesquite, you would notice a difference in your smoke. You would be able to tell them. But between, say, an oak and a hickory, I don't notice that much difference in the pellets. Now, some of that is because most of the pellet manufacturers do not make 100% pellets. For example, if you buy their hickory pellets, they're not 100% hickory. Most of them mix it with other fillers, alder or maple, and just have some hickory in it. So it's not as strong flavored from the hickory or the oak or whatever you're putting in it as you'd think. So yes, you will get a slight difference from the different pellets, but not a huge difference. Now, if you're in a competition where you're trying to get a specific flavor profile, then yeah, you'd want to worry about which kind of pellet you were using. Does that answer your question, Dave? Thanks, Dave. Okay, let's get back into cooking this hunk of pork. Now, I do recommend the use of a remote temperature probe. That's a probe that you put into the pork and then put the pork into the smoker so that you don't have to keep opening the smoker to know what the internal temperature of your meat is. The reason that's important is every time you open the lid of a smoker, you let temperature out, and the smoker has to get back up to temperature. The old saw amongst smokers is, if you're looking, you're not cooking. Once the meat's in, you pretty well want to let it go. Now, some people say you shouldn't use a thermometer, a probe, to put into the meat in the first hour from the argument that you're taking bacteria from the surface of the meat and pushing it into the center. If you cook for an hour, you've pretty well killed any of the bacteria on the surface. Now, again, many professionals just slam that old thermometer in, or they wait till later. But I want you to know there is a potential risk if you put it in right away. Now that the meat's in, and you've got your thermometer in it, and you're cooking the meat, you need to know about something called the stall. What happens is, as moisture leaves the surface of the meat, the surface actually can get colder while it's cooking, and the internal temperature won't go up and can even go down. And I can't tell you if there will be a stall for your meat. I cannot tell you how long the stall will last. That's why you have to cook by temperature instead of by time, because the stall is going to vary with every piece of meat that you have. Now, to get around the stall, there's something called the Texas crutch, which is nothing more than wrapping foil around the pork. Now, what the Texas crutch does is it keeps hot, humid air around the meat and shortens the stall. Some people say it softens the bark so it's not as dark and as crisp if you don't use the foil. And in my opinion, the internal texture of the meat's a little bit better with the foil. But the counter argument to that is, if you don't use the Texas crutch and don't wrap the foil around it, you'll get a better bark. And I say the bark is marginally better than without the foil. I like both. It's really something you have to try and find out the one you work with. But if you're deciding you're going to use foil or the Texas crutch, what you need to do is put the pork in for at least 3 hours. What you're looking for is a really nice brown surface on the pork. Other people wait till the internal temperature is over 150 degrees Fahrenheit or 65 centigrade and then wrap it in foil. But you want it in there for a while to start developing the bark. Then you want to wrap the foil around it and put your probe through the foil into the meat. It will take less time to cook it with the foil than without, but you'll get a better bark. It'll take longer without the foil, but the meat may be a bit tender with the foil. They're all really good. You want to try it and find out what you like. So before I go ahead any further, is there any questions on putting it in, whether to foil or not use foil, or basically using a temperature probe, or anything about the first part, just getting the meat in the smoker? Question for you. So now that we know that we're going to be, we made our decision whether we're going to foil or not. And once you've made that decision, the question that I hear most of the time after that is, how long is the pork going to take to smoke? How long until it's finished? It is impossible to tell exactly due to varying stall lengths. But the good news is that doesn't matter. We'll get to that in a second. I allow myself an hour and a half per pound of pork I'm cooking. If I'm going to use no foil, then I go for about an extra 10 minutes a pound, just to allow for the fact that it doesn't have the Texas crutch. It's not critical how long it will take, because when the pork is finished smoking to the internal temperature we're looking for, it's going to sit and rest for a few hours anyway, so you have a lot to work with. You can wrap a pork cup and put it in a cooler and store it for up to 4 hours with no problem. So if it's done early, that's not a sweat. However, if you really want to make sure your pork's done when your guests are ready, pulled pork reheats better than anything I've ever made. You can make the pork the day before, put it in a pan with just a little bit of water or stock, cover it with some foil, and put it in a 225-degree oven or 175-degree centigrade oven for an hour to an hour and a half, and it will be, people will never know you didn't cook it that day. So it doesn't really matter how long it takes for it to smoke. You can do it the same day, just make sure you do it early enough to allow a long resting period, or make it the day before and reheat it. But how do you know when it's done to take it out? Well, like I said, you cook to an internal temperature. And if you go online or talk to some of the pit masters, they'll tell you that any place from 200 degrees to 207 degrees. Now, my advice is don't rely on an exact temperature. When it gets about 200 degrees Fahrenheit or 93 degrees centigrade, I take a bamboo skewer, or you can use your instant read thermometer probe, and you can push it into the meat. It should go in just like butter. It should just push in with very little effort. The biggest mistake that most people make is they don't wait until it's that soft. They say, oh, it's 202, 203 degrees, and they think they'll be able to take it off any minute. It can take a long time to go from 203 to 205. But if you just use that probe method, so if it's at 200 and it's got pressure, cook it to 202 or 203. Try it again. Cook it to 204 or 205. Try it again. When that probe goes in till it's exactly smoothly goes in, then that is when your pulled pork is ready and not before. It'll give you an exact measure of the pork being done. Are there any questions on telling how long it cooks for, or making sure it's done, or any of that? Don't see any questions, so I'm going to go ahead. Okay, now that your pork is cooked and the skewer's gone in so easily, it's critical that you let the pork rest. What happens when the pork sits and rests is it takes moisture back into the pork, it spreads it evenly through it, and as it's cooling down from the high temperature of over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, the meat and fat actually become more tender. The collagen and fat continues to break down as the meat rests. But you don't want it to get cold. So if the pork was wrapped in foil, keep it in foil. If not, wrap it with foil now. Put a towel in the bottom of a camp cooler. Put the pork on the towel and cover it with another towel. And then let it rest for at least 2 hours. Close this up and let her sit. It can sit easily 4 or 5 hours, but you want at least 2 to allow it to smooth out. Now, is there any questions on letting the pork rest before I carry on? Thank you very much. Now that you've got it cooked, now's the time to pull the pork. The pork, even if it's been in the cooler for 4 hours, it will be hot. If you've got chef's fingers, you can do it by bare hands like I do, but if not, make sure you're wearing some insulated gloves or use a pair of bear claws or even 2 large forks and just pull it apart. The bone should just pull out of it with the meat coming right off very easily. That's another good sign that it's done well. And you will also find that even if you trim the pork well, there was large chunks of fat in the center of the meat, just pull them out with your fingers and they will go away. Now, when it was wrapped in the foil or in a pan, there will be juices that formed in the bottom of the pan or in the bottom of the foil. Taste them. If they're not too salty, defat them and sprinkle a little bit over the meat. It will add more flavor, but you don't need it. There is caution. The first time you take a piece of that dark bark and put it in your mouth, it's like eating potato chips. You just can't stop. There's a real tendency for the cook to eat most of the bark himself before he serves it to anybody else. So, are there any questions on actually pulling the pork or letting it rest? Okay, if you're using the juices in the bottom, there's two parts of fat to it. One is the chunks of fat in the pork. You can pull it with your fingers. But if you're using the juices in the bottom, Bill raises a good question. How do you get the fat off those juices and not mix them into your pork? There's a couple of different ways. You can get a special container that allows you to pour from under it with a spout that comes up. I just put the liquid in a cup and suck it out with a pastry baster. It looks like a big ball on the end, and you put it in, you suck it up, and it'll suck the juices from under the fat. Does that answer your question, Bill? Thank you, Bill. Okay, so let's get back into the presentation. Sorry about that. I'm getting old. Okay, so now that you've got your pulled pork done and you've shredded it up into long, beautiful pieces, how do you serve it? Well, you can just serve it exactly the way it is. It is delicious, just on a plate, you put it in your mouth. The rubs give a flavor to it, but I recommend a finishing sauce. And I'll give you a recipe for one in a second. And all a finishing sauce is it's usually some sweet vinegar base, and you just put a little bit into the pork, and it just brightens the flavor of that rich, succulent pork. You can also mix in a little bit of barbecue sauce or put barbecue sauce on the table. It's a big mistake that people, I think, put too much either finishing sauce or barbecue sauce in the meat. Just use a little bit and taste it as you go. You want less is better in this case. And what you're not serving right away, I like to freeze in sandwich-sized bags, because then you can just take it out, put a bit of liquid in it, and microwave it, and you got a great pulled pork sandwich. So don't be afraid to freeze it. It reheats really well. Now here's the finishing sauce recipe, and you'll see I use a little bit of vinegar, a little bit of maple syrup, a bit of pepper for some spice, a bit of cayenne. That's all it is. It's just to brighten it. So if you make your pulled pork, try putting a finishing sauce on it. Now here's mine. It's available on my blog, and it'll be available on the video at the end of this. But go online, there's many, many different finishing sauces to try. So, now are there any questions on the whole presentation? If so, I'll be happy to try and answer any questions you have on doing pulled pork. Dave asks, is there anything that's a no-no in the finishing sauce? And I'm going to get in trouble here because I hate people telling you you can't do something. If you like chocolate syrup on your pork, put chocolate syrup on your pork. But if you're going to go traditional, the finishing sauce is usually vinegar-based or mustard-based or the Carolina sweet tomato sauce type base. And those are the traditional ones. But people all around the world have used different things. I have used some Oriental char siu, which is a licorice sweet sauce on my pulled pork. It's delicious. Feel free to experiment. I hate anybody who says there's rules. Don't try that. I mean, you might likely wouldn't want to put, you know, tog droppings or frog droppings or something on it, but give it a try. No, it's pretty wide open what you like, but they're traditional, mustard-based, vinegar-based, or tomato-based. Does that answer your question, Dave? Dave asked, does the amount of bark you eat equate to how many glasses of wine you have while pulling the pork? I think it relates more to your amount of willpower. So if you're drinking a lot of wine, you likely have less willpower, and that means you're going to eat more of the bark while you're preparing it. Any other questions? Okay, I really appreciate you all tuning in. Because you're my friends and have my email address, I'd really appreciate any suggestions to improve this, what worked, what didn't work. If you could flip me an email at your convenience at the best time.